Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I can see the numbers rising, so good to see so many of you with us attending today's event, which is just one event in a sustainable business series of events and a campaign developed and delivered for you by the Greater Birmingham Chamber of Commerce in collaboration with Coventry and Warwickshire Chamber of Commerce. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Louise Bennett, and I am the Chief Executive of Coventry and Warwickshire Chamber of Commerce. I am also a Deputy Lieutenant of the West Midlands and the High Sheriff of the County of the West Midlands. And I don't know about you in your leadership roles, but whatever guise I am in, whatever role I play at work and indeed in the home, the impact of climate change is evident. We have floods one day and we have heat waves another. And in my lifetime, you can certainly no longer talk about a very typical British weather. And I guess that you are all aware that in just a month's time, the UK will host COP26, bringing countries and leaders and experts and politicians from 197 countries from across the world together in the UK to explore and hopefully agree further climate change action. You might also know that the UK has legislated a target of net zero by 2050. And so today, I think, gives us a chance to learn more about what net zero means to us in business. How can we better understand it? How can we play our role in it? So we're going to do a poll before introducing you to some of our speakers, but let me talk about the lineup of speakers that we have got today because they are absolutely fantastic. We have Miranda Barker, a colleague of mine, a Chief Executive of East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce and a member of the British Chambers of Commerce Climate Change Challenge Group. We have Laura Eyre and Leo Parkington, solicitors from Pinsent Masons. And we have Dr. Mark Swift, a colleague and a friend, the lead for small to medium-sized programmes at Warwick Manufacturing Group, part of Warwick University. Hopefully, towards the end of today, we'll get a chance to do a little bit of a Q&A before we close. So please use your chat function, and I will do my very, very best to put our thoughts and our questions to our eminent panel. Before we begin, I did want to say a big thank you, and I'm sure I'll say it at the end as well, but I did want to say a big thank you because it makes a difference to our sponsors of our sustainability campaign, and they are Aston University, Arup, Morgan Sindel and University of Birmingham. So if we're all sitting comfortably online today, doing our little bit to help reduce the carbon footprint, and I suspect most of us are struggling to get some fuel anyway, we will make a start. So let's move to our poll and then we'll be hearing from our speakers. So we have a poll. We're asking you what net zero means for small to medium-sized enterprises, whether over the last 12 months, reducing carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, has that become more or less of a priority for your business, for your organisation? And also, has your organisation implemented any measures to reduce carbon and or greenhouse gas emissions? I'm hoping you've had a chance to complete that poll. So let's start with our speakers. Miranda, we're going to come to you first. As I said, Miranda is a member of the British Chamber's Climate Change Challenge Group. Over to you, Miranda.
Good morning. Good morning. It's great to be here. I hope you're all well. And if you're anything like me, you are using your energy today. It's absolutely horrible here today weather-wise. So it's good that we're here talking to each other. So in terms of presentation, let me just share my screen for you. I have just 4 slides I want to take you through. I am, as Louisa said, I'm the Chief Executive of East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce, and I'm the co-chair of the Chamber's Climate Challenge Group, working with all of the 53 chambers across the UK. Net zero, obviously, is a topic that's coming towards us very, very quickly now. But just to look back slightly, in East Lancashire, for instance, our area ranges from just to the east of the M6, where we've got British Aerospace, to just to the west of Yorkshire, where we've got Rolls-Royce aero engines. So that's a really heavy manufacturing area. So how do we work with our business communities? How do we encourage them to go down this path? Well, net zero is just the latest in a whole succession of terms we've looked at. That is sort of try and encapsulate this drive. If we look backwards, and I'm an environmental consultant, so I've been doing this since about 1993. We've seen a whole variety of different topics and names for this subject come through, from early waste minimisation and Project Catalyst, which works with some of the biggest companies in the UK to try and reduce waste, then through sustainability, which professionals in the industry debated for 20 years what sustainability meant and never came up with a firm answer, through corporate social responsibility and ESG, and now very much this year it's net zero. And the advantage that net zero has over those previous terms is at least it has a finite calculation. And you see before you the definition from the Committee on Climate Change, saying net zero emissions means that the total of active removals from the atmosphere offsets any remaining emissions from the rest of the economy. So literally net zero emissions as we understand it to be. You can still get consultants who will debate what this means in practicality, but at least it gives us a fixed target to work towards. But as with all of those things that came before it, sustainability, waste minimisation, CSR, ESG, it always has got to come from a business point of view. And that's, I think, what government and international lobbyists need to remember, is we have to make sure this is an argument that works for our businesses. Because if our businesses aren't alive and working, then they're not able to manage their emissions. So it's how do we work with businesses to drive the agenda forward? And obviously the first thing you hear when we've done surveys across the British Chambers of Commerce with all of our smaller members especially, them saying we need financial help, we need subsidies, we need grant schemes. Subsidies don't always help because they can do what happened with the recent solar panel industry, where it inflated the demand on a very short-term basis. And then as soon as the subsidy was removed, it took away the economic carrot that people thought was there. They need to understand the benefit for its own sake in terms of the business health of their organisation. And on the other side, you hear from a lot of the bankers I've been working with on their journey to ESG, you hear them saying, we want standards, we want fixed standards for all of our suppliers to work towards. That isn't going to help our SME audience. That isn't going to help our small businesses, because that just gives them another thing they have to buy that costs them £3,000 or £4,000, whereas that money would be best put into reducing their environmental impact. So how do we drive forward this agenda? There are two things I want to bring to mind. First is that there are an awful lot of policy decisions we're trying to support government and drive government and infuse them in making that will give us a natural encouragement forward in the take-up of low-carbon technologies and making these things a business imperative rather than a nice-to-have. Procurement standards. If we have really strong procurement standards from our local authorities, from national government, from government-financed contracts, so the building of HS2, the work through all of those primes and suppliers within that. If there are firm procurement standards that all suppliers need to adhere to, that immediately wakes up the attention of those SMEs trying to move towards good business, but also performing and supplying into those contracts. If we have national planning standards and baselines, whether those are local authority builds, whether there's a housing association builds, whether they're any kind of approval for residential, commercial building, if we look at really firm planning standards for environmental and energy efficiency standards within those buildings, and also standards for retrofitting when things are being rented out. The others are pretty self-explanatory. Minimum recycled percentage of recycled material in anything that's manufactured, increasing landfill tax, energy sourcing, looking at where we're getting our energy from, and looking at subsidy policies for carbon intensive energy. Having a visible carbon taxation system. If you're a member of a PLC or a much larger firm, you've been dealing with ESOS, and you've been dealing with a really visible carbon taxation scheme. If you're an SME, you have possibly been able to ignore the fact that there is carbon taxation on your energy bill already, and you haven't really seen your energy bill as something that you can control and you can minimize, but that is also being taxed to try and drive you in this direction. So if we can actually get government to move forward on these policy decisions and make this sort of firm demand of the world, then we can actually see an economic drive towards the take-up of low carbon technologies. And a key thing with all of those policy decisions is they aren't policy commitments that require an awful lot of investment from government. They're just things they can try and force as concepts. But how do we drive forward the businesses, the SMEs, when all of those policy decisions are in place? We need to try and communicate with them the opportunity, but also the threat. Lack of action in this field really is a threat. And I think that's the issue, is that in this pressured climate, through Brexit, through COVID, it hasn't felt like an immediate threat. If you're an SME, if you're a very small business, you're dealing with the fact that your VAT bill's due at the end of the week, your payroll is due at the end of the month. You're dealing with all of those immediate risks. Energy pricing now, the fact that your staff can't get in because they haven't got petrol, all of these things feel much more immediate. But we really need to make sure that the argument is strong and heard about just how important this is, not just in the long term, but in the medium term and in the short term. So there are three areas across that bell curve of enthusiasm for a move towards environmental proactivity in our business community. And they'll be familiar to all of you. Obviously, there's the early adopter advantage. We've heard some great businesses across the UK in terms of our own best practice examples, where those businesses have grasped this as something they want to use, first possibly as a showcase, to say we are being green, we are working towards net zero. But then they've realised that actually the pound of their customer is really being flexed now by just how green, just how close to net zero those firms are. People are making decisions based on that basis. And we have seen a huge acceleration in this choice being made over the last 12 months. We've seen stakeholders, shareholders, staff, future employees, the next generation of employees especially being very, very conscious of the credibility of their employers, of their suppliers. And it is becoming a mechanism of choice. Later this afternoon, there's a British Chambers of Commerce event. And speaking on that event is Richard Hagan from a local company to us called Crystal Doors. And they do what it says on the tin, they make doors. And they have not only attracted a massive amount of new business, and they were in trouble before they took this, but they've also made an awful lot of business sense on their bottom line. And I'll come to that. The second thing that we want to make sure we're getting across to our small and medium-sized enterprises is, if you're not going to be one of those early adopters, realize that your customer and your supplier market is moving in this direction. And if you aren't able to keep up with it, you will lose those supply contracts. And I know we've got a lot of large firms with us today. And I think that's a really positive action that you can take to drive not only your own position, obviously, but all the way out into what they call those scope 3 impacts, the impacts across your supply chain. Take your small suppliers with you. Don't make it something which feels hard and a barrier they can't cross. Be an enthuser to them. We're working with companies like British Aerospace in our local area, and they have 500 local SMEs supplying into them. Imagine if you're an SME who's struggling, who know you're sort of second or third tier in that supply chain, and you get a communication from British Aerospace saying, we want you to work with us on this. We'll invite you to a business event on our premises in Samlesbury, at the home of the Eurofighter, and we want to work with you to take you down this journey and help you be more positive and proactive in this field and knit you even closer to us as a supplier. Every SME in that supply chain is going to go. It's going to their premises, it's being with them, it's forging that closer relationship. So that piece of being able to knit yourself more firmly into your supply chain of your prime customer is really important. And the same thing with the public sector. If your public sector, it's a local authority, and the wider public sector, public funded, whether it's the NHS or local schools, if all of those public sector organisations are saying, to supply into us, you need to be shown, so to be showing that you're really proactive in this field. That's going to be very, very positive in terms of drawing that mid-market of SMEs onwards. Lastly, of course, and you will always get a percentage of SMEs that won't move in a direction that they really need to for business reasons until it becomes financially painful. And before last week, it didn't say energy bills on there. It just said rising costs and carbon taxation. And this is really making that carbon taxation much more visible to SMEs. And last year, there was a government green paper consulting about how did they take that ethos, that really visible carbon taxation system, right down to SMEs with anyone more than 5 employees. So that is coming. But right now, immediately, of course, we've got the energy crisis. Seems like an inflammatory word to call it, but right now, if you're trying to find petrol, it does feel like an energy crisis. Those energy bills rising and rising. This is a moment to be able to say to our supply chains and our customers and our local SMEs that it really is a visible cost to your business. Look at what your electricity bill is doing. Look at the amount it's going up. How much more product do you have to make to be able to get that much more in surplus to pay for that rising energy bill? If you can reduce that energy bill, reduce your baseline costs, you make your business so much more profitable from the get-go. So those rising costs, but also that stick of carbon taxation will happen. But our job as business organizations and customers and suppliers is to try and drive our SME supply chain in this direction before it becomes painful, before it becomes financially damaging, and we actually see rising costs hurting our supply chain. We need to get them to be as proactive as possible moving in this direction. So those are really the policy decisions we're calling for government to make, and the business opportunities and risks we're trying to communicate to our business audience. So lastly, I just wanted to give you a small advertisement for the various things that are going on in terms of Chambers of Commerce, but also in terms of the run-up to COP26. There's a whole host of events happening locally in Glasgow that you can go to, but also you can tap into by signing up through central portals in British Chamber of Commerce. Are obviously linked through your local Chamber of Commerce team, and Louise and Will and Demi as well. And the British Chambers of Commerce site at the top there, that is the one to register for the free low carbon events on COP26 that you can sign up to. The Glasgow Chamber of Commerce are leading on the International Climate Chamber mission, and you can sign in some of those international events. So those are happening on the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of November. And then obviously you can get wider support through the British Chambers of Commerce Net Zero Hub, and within that, the zerocarbonbusiness.uk tool, which is supported by all of the business organisations and trade associations and the electricity producers nationally. So there's masses of sources of advice and support to help you and your supply chain move in this direction. But most of all, please talk to Louise and team. And I hope to be here to take any questions from you later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. That was brilliant, and really, really helpful to have that overview, I guess, have that understanding of the policy context in terms of sustainability and net zero. And the one message that certainly came through your presentation for me was that message that net zero, sustainability, climate change, whatever words we choose to use, net zero has to be deliverable. It has to be deliverable by business, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in the Q&A session, where we could ask some questions around that. If I can remind our audience, again, lovely to see so many people here with us today. Please do feel free to put your thoughts or your questions through our Q&A function, and it'd be really good to hear from you. Okay, guys, let's move on. I have the pleasure of introducing our colleagues from Pins & Masons. They are Laura Eyre and Leo Parkington, solicitors, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about net zero and what that means within our services sector. So over to you, Leo and Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Leo, you okay to share the slides?
Yeah, should hopefully be up now.
Perfect, that's great. So yeah, just I guess thank you very much for the quick intros. We are both sat within our commercial team at Pinsent Mason. So we did a lot with the supply chain, dealing both with sort of the contracting, but also the strategy that sits behind them. And then we also wear other hats within our business, which we essentially sit on our climate change and advisory team. So we're here just to really reiterate essentially why it matters, to build on a little bit of what Miranda's been talking about already this morning, and perhaps to talk you through some practical steps which you can be taking as SMEs and what you can be doing to engage with the supply chain, and then just finish up with a brief case study, in fact, on ourselves as a service provider business ourselves. So next slide, please, Leo. So hopefully you can see from this slide, it should be a pretty obvious graphic that this is a serious issue. And we all know about the melting ice caps, loss of wildlife habitats and rising sea levels, which often seem too remote really for us in our day-to-day lives, but it's absolutely a critical issue for businesses too. We were speaking with one of our manufacturing clients actually just a couple of weeks ago, and they realised that actually 2 of their sites based in the Netherlands would actually be well underwater within 50 years. So this isn't just an issue that's affecting wildlife, it absolutely is affecting businesses, and therefore as a result supply chains all across the globe. So hopefully that graphic, as I say, really hits home as to the rapid pace of change and the absolute critical need to do something. Next slide, please, Leo. We thought it'd be useful just to give you a bit of background and to build on sort of the policy piece that Miranda's already talked about. You may hear people talk about the Paris Agreement, and we just thought it'd give you a bit of a flavour just to upskill a little bit in this area. So the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change, and it was adopted at COP21 in Paris. It was essentially adopted by 196 countries and entered into force in November 2016. And its goal essentially is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. And to achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible to achieve a climate neutral world by mid-century. And how the Paris Agreement actually works, it works in a 5-year cycle. And by 2020, countries had to submit their plans for the climate action known as nationally determined contributions. They're called NDCs. And in their NDCs, countries essentially communicate actions that will take to reduce their climate gas, their greenhouse gas emissions. And they communicate those NDCs and as well as the actions they're going to take to build resilience to adapt to those. So you can see right from the very top, obviously government needs to be complying with these obligations. As I say, it's a legally binding treaty, and that clearly needs to be flowing down to businesses. So the UK's NDC was to cut 68% of its emissions by 2030 and has since pledged to cut to 78% of its emissions by 2035. And that has actually been enshrined in the Climate Change Act. So it's not just something that we can ignore, it's something we've absolutely committed to be doing. And I'm going to pass across now to Leah to talk a little bit about scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Again, a bit of jargon busting.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, hi everyone. Before we jump into steps small and medium enterprises may take to reduce carbon, I think it's worth providing a bit of background around a phrase you may have heard in the past, scoped emissions. So these were set out in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in order to give a consistent and transparent approach to carbon accounting throughout the world. So scope 1 is direct emissions and scope 2 and 3 indirect, i.e. off-site emissions. Scope 1 is fairly simple, company facilities, so office spaces, often the case for service providers, and company vehicles like your fleet. Scope 2 are your indirect off-site emissions, usually caused through the purchase of electricity. So you turn a light switch on in your office and the actual emissions are further down the line at a power plant, which may be from a fossil fuel or ideally from renewables. And then scope 3, which are really the key scope here to look at. They are essentially all other indirect emissions, which are largely caused by your supply chain. The GHG protocol splits them into 15 categories, as you can see on screen, and they're then divided up into upstream and downstream activities. Looking at the service sector particularly, I think upstream purchase goods and services, so purchase of raw materials for your business or for service sector in particular, outsourced intangible services. waste generated in operations. So for a law firm like us, that'll often be paper waste, and travel, such as business travel, employee commuting into work. And looking at downstream, I mean, this will largely depend on your business, but if there are deliverables in the services you provide, then the processing of those deliverables, the use of them from your customers, and how your customers deal with them at end of life. So are they recycled, are they thrown away? Scope 3 also covers other things like investments and franchises.
Okay, so we thought we'd move now on to what we're essentially seeing in business at the moment, what we're seeing with our client base. So in terms of the overall strategy piece, depending on the size, obviously, of your business, you need to essentially communicate what your strategy is going to be. Once you've kind of worked out where, for example, your key carbon emissions sit, where your scope 3 particularly, and also looking at your scope 2, what have you done about your energy supplies? Is there something you can be switching to that helps you on this journey? But once you've kind of worked out what your strategy is, it's really important to make sure that everyone in the business is actually aware of what that is, working with your colleagues. In some of the larger businesses we're working with, they might have a head of sustainability, which I'm sure in some of your SMEs here today won't have that key roles where they can take it off. So it's really incumbent on you all to get together and join with that. And I think actually echoing really what Miranda was talking about earlier about steering groups, we're increasingly seeing suppliers working with their supply chain, bringing them on board, forming parts of steering groups. So absolutely be getting yourselves involved, because it's those that you can get the help that you need. They will often have independent advisors sitting there to help advise everybody in the room around the small steps that they can be taking. Now, you as your business yourself, you need to also be assessing your own supply chain. You need to be looking at where in your supply chain are your essentially your worst offenders as such, and try and target how you can seek to reduce those emissions that are coming from that supply. And then you need to be really measuring reporting. Increasingly, as we'll come on to later, as part of the procurement process, you absolutely need to be able to identify and show the data that's sitting behind the carbon targets and the carbon emissions that you're stating and sharing with your own customers. And then we need to be thinking about incentive structures, whether that's yourself on the receiving end or also for your own supply chain. What can you do to the extent to which you work with them? Can you offer them more business? Can you do essentially bonus payments to the extent to which you're able to offer those? You may well be on the receiving end of those. It's something just to be aware of. And then aside from the contractual mechanisms, which we'll kind of probably park for another day really, because it's getting really into the weeds, but we're increasingly seeing people working together in their contracts to form what we'd call maybe non-binding charters. We're trying to embed low carbon thinking across the supply chains that everybody's working towards trying to achieve the same goal.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I think the important message here is that tackling supply chain emissions is really challenging. You saw on that previous slide that you've got your 3 scopes and the 15 categories within it. You really have to cast a wide net in order to capture all of the emissions throughout your supply chain. I think some of the key challenges that we see are really data driven. So is the data available along your supply chain? And that will depend on your suppliers. Do you tend to work with your larger suppliers that frankly have got the budget to do their carbon accounting, or do you work with small suppliers that are probably less used to receiving carbon questionnaires and carbon queries from their customers? And then where data is received, obviously you're relying on the supply chain, those third-party external organizations. So how reliable is that data that you receive? I think we have a concept on there of embodied carbon, and this is a good example of how complex your analysis of your business analysis of your carbon can be. Taking building a house, for example, embodied carbon is looking at the life cycle of the carbon throughout each material in that house. So through from your initial extraction methods like mining and forestry, production, manufacture, transport, and then lastly construction. There are carbon given off at all stages, and embodied carbon really shows that throughout the life cycle it's really complex analysis. Okay, so what next essentially for service providers? Again,
expect essentially most procurements to increasingly be asking you for this data. They need to be able to demonstrate to particularly where they're servicing public bodies, to the government departments, etc., that their business and their supply chain is transitioning to being a low carbon one. They need to demonstrate how their works, their service will provide a low carbon solution. And quite increasingly, we're seeing in bids, we're seeing two proposals put forward, one for their normal BAU proposal and one for a lower carbon option. And then it's up to your customer to try and identify how much they're willing to pay essentially for that lower carbon option, and increasing that is moving up the agenda. So there is always that ability as a smaller company to put forward two prices, put forward a price that actually this is how, if we do it as we've always done it, this is if we want to try and invest and make a difference and help them on their own journeys, because remember, you're all part of working towards that same goal. I think it was definitely brought out in Miranda's session. This is either going to be a great opportunity or a great challenge. And the chances are, if you're not with them, you will be left behind. So it's not something that you can leave for another day. As challenges as all sound, you kind of need to start somewhere. And I think the reality is start today, and we'll come on a bit later on, just in a couple of minutes, onto the kind of small steps you can be taking. But absolutely, it's a critical issue that's only rising on the agenda.
Yeah, so I think we've pulled out here two key steps that we see SMEs in the service sector taking. The first is energy and power. Obviously, a large emitter of greenhouse gases is our office spaces and our fleets. It's important to implement optimization and efficiency measures within your facilities. That can be as simple as motion sensor lights and turns off after themselves. It can be larger investments like on-site renewables and solar panels, or it can be setting policies so that your new release renewals or expiry of facilities, you've got a policy in place of the minimum efficiencies you expect from your premises. Increasing trend we see over the last couple of years has been the purchase of electrical vehicles. I think Royal Mail were the last business I saw to set out a guarantee that they would change over to complete EVs by 2030. And also with that, the investment into EV, have you got plug-in points, for example, in your business so that you can incentivize your customers and your employees to drive to your premises in a more sustainable way. And then lastly, on energy and power, analysing your own energy supplier. Do you know where your energy supplier for your business gets that energy? Are they a green supplier or not? I think that's one of the, we talk about the difficulties of the supply chain, or that's one of the sort of scope 2, perhaps easier wins that you can, try and take away today to ask that energy supplier. Secondly, then moving on to contracting, I mentioned earlier, are your supply chain able to provide you with the data you need for your accounting? Well, a second question to that is, are they willing? And a good way to incentivize your supply chain is through your contracting mechanisms. It's important to take a strategic approach to carbon in your contracts. That may be through including carbon KPIs to incentivize targets or absolute obligations, and they could be linked to service credits, or on the more extreme end, breach or termination right if targets are not met. You may be considering whether you will be able to negotiate that into your supply chains. But I think when we talk about a strategic approach, it's really important to understand where you are in the life cycle of your contracts. So where have you got a break date coming up, or a termination right, for example, where you might be able to leverage a little bit of bargaining power to talk about carbon. And then, if that's not the case, then, non-binding charters, bonus payments for targets met. These are things that we see increasingly in areas like the property management market, for example. Lastly, on this slide, I think a bullet there on collaboration mechanisms, and Laura mentioned earlier, it's important to ensure that supply chains are working collaboratively. BT, for example, have like an annual climate change summit for the whole supply chain. There might be overkill for many SMEs, but I think the message here is it's important to have a joint development of ways that you can improve. And lastly, on the legal side of things, one thing to mention is if you're not sure where to start on clauses and things like that, The Chancery Lane project is a not-for-profit for which many law firms volunteer for, including Pinsent Masons, and they offer a really good free clause bank for all the clauses mentioned here. So yeah, feel free to Google Chancery Lane project for that. Okay, conscious of time, so we're just going to rattle through really a bit of a brief case study, and we thought we'd actually use ourselves as a service business ourselves and the steps that we've taken. Now, we are on the largest side. We do have a global network with 26 offices and sort of over 3,600 staff. So our biggest issue, particularly at the moment, is business travel. But taking this kind of diagram from 12 o'clock around, we had to do a lot of internal auditing to understand ourselves, where we got to, where are our key emissions coming from, and to be able to then essentially pick the low-hanging fruit and then work out what the bigger issues were. So even from ourselves, where, for example, we may engage consultants to help with our business. We looked at our standard contracts that we have with consultants to make sure that, how is it we're saying that they can travel to us? Are they jumping on flights, or could they actually get a train? So we made some really simple changes to some of those contracts. And again, it's kind of, to coin someone else's phrase, every little helps essentially, and it's getting us on that road. We then started to look at setting science-based targets, and this has been a big commitment from us, which is something that, again, may or may not be suitable for everybody on this call, but it's absolutely something to be thinking about. And you may be able to get assistance further up your supply chain if they also are very much wanting you to get on board and making sure that they can demonstrate in turn to their own customers. But essentially, as a business ourselves, it was a long process, but actually worth it in the end. We are now committed to essentially reducing our 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 50% by 2030 from a base year of 2019. And then we're also committed to annual sourcing of renewable electricity from 75% in 2019 to 100% by 2030. We've taken the measures that Leah's already talked about, so things like building efficiency. We've made sure we've got have LED lighting. We make sure that we have demand side response technologies to make sure we're reducing that energy consumption. And we're making sure we have a minimum sustainability and efficiency standards for all our new office acquisitions as well. We've considered our own internal policies, for example, particularly around things like travel policies, really questioning our staff. Do you need to be there? Do you need to be traveling? Or can you actually just jump on a Zoom call? We've also looked at the procurement of our renewable energy. Almost 80% of our energy is currently from renewable sources. And we've also got the potential for a virtual power plant agreement with a renewable developer as well. So something, again, area where we're really looking into. A key thing for us at the moment is that reduction of business travel, and we're doing that obviously through the use of increased technology, improved visibility of travel choices in our booking tools. And we had, for example, a session earlier today actually within our business from Mike Berners-Lee, who's son of Berners-Lee, who created the internet, but he's very much in the climate change space as well, and gave us some really useful tips for our employees about what they can be doing in their everyday lives to help reduce emissions. And that was something that went down extremely well as a business. And then finally, we're looking at the management of our supply chain. We're working both Procurement Gateway and also CDP membership, which again, another one to Google. And that helps to ensure that our suppliers meet a predetermined level of KPIs at the start of our contracts and during the term of the agreement. So hopefully just set out a few examples there of things you could be thinking about, something to perhaps take away from today. So again, happy to answer any questions at the end, but we'll pass across to Mark now. That's okay.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Leo. I think we've all seen on the chat that we will get a copy of the slides, because certainly that set of slides, Laura and Leo, are almost a good checklist. They're a good checklist for anybody working within the services sector. And I also noticed on the chat and the Q&A that Nathaniel was asking, well, what is the services sector? For the purpose of this event today, Nathaniel, we use the term the services sector as quite a broad term. So it does include consultancy, legal firms, accountancy firms, marketing firms, IT firms, all of which, of course, are very different. But for the purposes of this event, it is a very broad term. So now, having looked at our services sector, let's hear a little bit around our manufacturing sector from Dr. Mark Swift, lead at the small to medium sized enterprise programs over at Warwick Manufacturing Group. Thank you, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, thanks for joining us this morning and such a great panel before. So the problem is going towards the end of the presentations that you feel that you're going to go over some of the old ground. So I'm going to hopefully put a slightly different perspective on this and talk about, as Louise says, some lessons from the manufacturing sector, perhaps, which are useful for all businesses, I hope. and give you some tips, some carrots, I think, as Miranda mentioned, that might be useful for to drive some change. So I'm Mark Swift. I head small business programs at University of Warwick, Warwick Manufacturing Group. We're also part of a high value manufacturing catapult. Some of the logos you see at the bottom of the screen there. We work with about 500 small manufacturers a year up and down the country, really helping them to transition to, it might be to new technology, it might be to new sectors, it might be to new ways of doing business, really, I guess. But so I'm going to today, though, talk about perhaps what the size of the opportunity is, I think, where we are with that opportunity, what's the latest research? And there's been quite a lot of research in this, particularly around small businesses recently. And then talk about some of the pathways, and Laura, Leo, Miranda has mentioned some of these sort of pathways to net zero, perhaps you can take. And interesting, I've just seen some of the Q&A that's come up, where you can go for some of the help as well, because there is quite a lot of help and support out there, but it is a bit of a jungle. Maybe fair to say there's lots of different areas to go for support. So without further ado then, so just starting sort of the high level really, and we'll drill down pretty quickly if that's okay. Look at the UK greenhouse gases really, you can see that the main sources of greenhouse gases are transport, energy, followed by business, agriculture, residential, etc. So there's a significant a variety of areas where the greenhouse gases are generated. If you look at small businesses as a subset of that, who are the most people on the call, you'll find that actually 99% of all businesses in the UK are small, but obviously go from micro all the way up to 250 employees or so. But in terms of the greenhouse gases, though, it's about half of that actually comes from the small business of UK private sector firms. Take out public sector and MOD and education, all those sort of things. It's about 48% of our greenhouse gases comes from the small business sector. And increasingly what we're seeing is, of course, asking for small businesses to start that transition to using sustainable energy, perhaps, or reducing energy consumption, or traveling less, as some of my colleagues just said. But the research says pretty much, and this research that came from the British Chambers only in August this year, that only actually 1 in 10 small businesses are able or currently measuring their carbon footprint. So there's lots to go out there, really, I guess. If we can get from 1 in 10 to 1 in maybe to 3 in 10 to 4 in 10, we can really start to shift and really try to drive some change, get more businesses on the pathway, really, I guess. Now, over the summer period, there's a lot of data on this next slide, but over the summer period, working with the Aston University and Warwick Business School, we did a survey of about 1,100 small businesses up and down the UK, and that's cross-sector, that's just not manufacturing. That does include services and professional sector and construction and manufacturing, etc. But about 1,100 businesses, anyway to say, were surveyed, and what it highlighted really that they, of course, were increasingly asked to comply with net zero policies to reduce their greenhouse emissions and indirect emissions. However, we know how busy small businesses can be, and how we've all been particularly busy over the last year because of EU transition and COVID, and a lot of change going on. Probably more in the sector I work with, in the automotive sector in particular, more changes happening in the next 5 years, probably happened in the last 100 years because of electrification, which is all part of this net zero. Net zero, in terms of how you run a business, is probably not the number one priority. Let's be honest. You're dealing with the day-to-day. You're dealing with getting through what you have to do as a day-to-day business, perhaps. And what we're trying to do, I think, what we're trying to think about sort of longer term, really, how we can actually make net zero the number one, or certainly to higher up your agenda, really. What the researchers said, and this is just a snapshot from the manufacturing sector of that 1,100 survey I just mentioned. But the primary driver for change, really, I guess, is reducing costs, and I absolutely makes sense. If you're going to do it, there has to be a commercial opportunity, doesn't it? There has to be a carrot, I think, which what Miranda mentioned. There has to be a reason to do it. The biggest change, really, I guess, is if you can reduce cost, you can see that something I could do sooner rather than later, really, I guess. And there's other sort of highlights in there as well, improving your image and reputation, and particularly the request of some of your customers and supply chains or value chains you sit within. The other trend I just want to highlight though on here is that we're now seeing a shift, I think, from net zero products. So from electric vehicles, for example, maybe some of the packaging we're using and being more sustainable, etc. But from net zero products to how we make those products, to the factories that they sit within to make those carbon net zero or reduce carbon emissions, etc. And then the next step after that will be then, I think, how the supply chains then operate. We all sit in, and again, Laura and Leo mentioned that really. It's the whole supply chain and all the businesses, how you procure things, how you source things. Maybe there's an opportunity to source things more locally in the UK rather than sourcing things from across the world. The example that slightly horrified me recently was that the trade deal with Australia and bringing in meat production from Australia into the UK. What's the implication of that on zero emissions, on carbon emissions? It's quite concerning, isn't it? I think so. I think it does bring commercial opportunity as well about how we can actually source locally, and which has an impact on the supply chain. But as I said, there's this shift that is going on from the whole net zero race to electrification, particularly in my sector, but also the sort of net zero products, into how we make those products, and then ultimately how the supply chain operates. So I'm just going to then just touch on a couple of pathways, really, perhaps that possible pathways you could take, and we've touched on these previously, I guess, a little bit. But I think there's two main sort of areas where there's organizational changes you can make within the business. And I'll mention some of those in a minute. And then there's the technology or perhaps the innovation changes you can make with the business. And then again, this came out of the survey we did over the summer. But I guess to go through that pathway, really, I think from our observations, work with the 500 manufacturers we work with annually, I think, we would always advocate really start sooner rather than later. And what I mean by that, I think the legislation is going to catch up. The legislation is coming pretty quickly. There's a lot of debate, there's going to be a lot of debate in carbon at COP26 coming very shortly. But this debate will turn into legislation. I'm pretty sure it will do. So the sooner we start, I think you probably the competitive advantage you can have, but also probably a financial impact as well. But as I said earlier, measuring where you are is something that would actually give you the opportunity to identify where to start, really. And there's lots of organizations out there that can help you do that. I'll mention some of those in a minute to sort of measure where to go, understanding what where the hotspots are, where's the low hanging fruit, where are the things we can quickly do. And I've got an example of a business of that. He's taken some of those sort of quick wins. Improve by, do it step by step. Collaborate with your suppliers, your customers, the other businesses perhaps in your sector, really, to get some of that learning, really. Maybe join a cohort, and there's these emerging cohorts and groups of businesses who are coming together to sort of drive some change. And then finally, celebrate some of your successes, really. Make it interesting. I think if you some of the businesses who are the early adopters are using that a way to celebrate success with their employees, but also with their customers, and winning work now. So you can actually, it's great for PR. I mean, it's great for the planet. Don't get me wrong, that's the most important thing, but it's also good for business. And I say there are operational sort of net zero practices you can do, really, on the left of the screen, really. So how you measure an environmental report, the training of your people in the organization, your market research, and how you compare with your customers. We mentioned an awful lot about sustainable procurement, whether that's your energy supply or materials in your business or doing lots. So there's an awful lot of operational changes, travel less, that you can do, which are relatively quite straightforward, straightforward. But it does start with the leadership within the business, really, I think. And as business leaders, I think we have that responsibility, really, to bring change into our firms, really. And the one thing I would say is we can make it attractive. You can make it interesting, because this is such an important, issue for our future generations. I think we've got to make it interesting. And I'm glad Miranda mentioned Crystal Doors earlier. Crystal Doors is it's a cabinet door manufacturer. They make doors for kitchens, etc. They're in Rochdale, North England. WMG's been doing some work with them recently. But they're phenomenal in terms of their steps to net zero. They intend to be a net zero business by 2022, not by 2030 or 2050, but by 2022. So some businesses, and they've won a tremendous amount of awards. There's some big firms that are doing some quite good work in there, such as Midas and Brewdog. But small business can also make those sort of steps and be early adopters. So I'm just going to go into a very quick technological or innovation example. So I think I'll wrap through this quite quickly, conscious of time. So a business based locally in the Birmingham area, JCM Contracts. They do joinery for the construction industry. But one of the product lines they have is they make cubicles for washrooms. And the challenge really is to limit the environmental impacts of some of the waste they generate. The laminated paper resin, they generate something like a ton of offcuts per month, which goes to landfill. That's quite common, because it's extremely difficult to recycle. There's lots of reasons. And we did an assessment on that, and this is just on one product line, on one material on that product line. It was costing about £7,000 a year, so it's real money. But importantly, 336 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Now, to put that into perspective, the average passenger vehicle, depending on miles and the type of vehicle, etc., and a duty cycle, is between 3 and 5 tons per annum. So, if that's the equivalent of perhaps 100 vehicles a year of CO2 just on that production line, on that particular material for that particular product. So lots to go out there. So you may have seen this before. There's a waste hierarchy, from disposal, which is the last resort, absolutely, which perhaps where they were at the moment, to refusal to not have this product in a material in their product line in the first place. WMG went through through this waste hierarchy, and we set a number of objectives against each of the lines, from recovering energy from their existing material, what going to landfill, to using an alternative material. And then so some immediate wins that we helped the company identify. There's an immediate, okay, let's take some energy out. Let's use some of that to generate some energy. And that immediately had a 36% decrease in carbon emissions, and also reduced their cost by 15%. So fab, really easy, quick win. We're now looking at how we can then drive the yield on that material, so you get more out of less, so less offcuts. And now the next project, a little bit more research project, in terms of how we can then look at alternative materials. So maybe materials which have natural origin, natural plant origin sources, for example. There's lots of great work going on that space. And then the last couple of things, really, I sort of mentioned, there are lots of sources of help out there. Miranda mentioned quite a lot, obviously, the British Chambers of Commerce, they have the events and the signposting, the Net Zero Hub. Always obviously go to your Chamber of Commerce first. More locally, of course, there's a number of organisations out there will help you generate a carbon emissions audit and see where you are. Support available in Coventry, Warwickshire for the Green Business Programme, and of course WMG. We quick plug for WMG. We run a series of events similar to this, but really around sort of best practice within the sector. It's called SPINS, Sustainable Production Innovation Network. And the next one's in a couple of weeks. By all means, come to that. But we're really about sharing knowledge and getting businesses to go on that journey. We have the various themes. The next theme is on design for sustainability, design at the beginning of the product, design sustainability, and as well design for efficiency, or design for logistics, or design for manufacture, but design for sustainability right at the beginning. We're going to see this innovation projects, and there was a project we just mentioned a minute ago with JCM. But we also put cohorts of companies together. So we got cohorts together with a large OEM at the moment, and their UK supply chain. put companies together to share knowledge, go on best practice visits, and to really equip them for the future, really, I guess. So that's what I really wanted to say. Just in summary, really, I think, all this debate you're hearing of COP26, etc. I'm confident, that is going to turn into action. It's going to turn into legislation. So, I think the time is now to sort of say that, is the challenge of this decade. Let's be honest. We're seeing more demand from conscious customers who want to be dealing with conscious suppliers. As I said earlier, we've seen a shift from net zero products or green to maybe to green manufacturing, and then to green supply chains. There's different approaches. There's the organisation approaches you can take about maybe how you source your energy, for example, to more innovation and technology. You can make small steps now, and you should be able to. But going back right to the beginning, what I said about the research says it has to be a financial benefit. I think those small steps, you've got to have that in mind, of course. And there's lots of help and support out there. It is very complex, and I'm sure Louise will agree with that, or have a comment on that as well. But there's lots of business support out there that can help you, but talk to your customers, talk to your suppliers as well. And that's what I want to say. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Brilliant, Mark. Thank you. And again, we'll have a copy, if it's okay, Mark, we'll have a copy of his slides that we'll send out to delegates. Because again, those slides are really helpful. I love your concept of the pathway to net zero, very similar to where Laura and Leo spoke about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, with lots of ideas and lots of thoughts for our small to medium sized enterprises on the call today in terms of what they could actually do within their business. And Mark, I love the waste hierarchy. I've never seen that, never heard of that. And again, that's, in your words, that sort of tool, that audit, all of that kind of stuff is really, really useful to businesses on the ground. Now, guys, I've got 15 minutes and I have got a fair few questions that have come through. I just want to be fair to my panel and give them a heads up on my last question. So my last question, guys, as we come to a close, which will be at 11:15, I just want you to give us an example of where you've seen best practice. So a case study that might come to mind. We've heard about the kinds of stuff you're aware of or you might be doing, but yeah, if we can end on some real positive in terms of just a case study or some best practice from each of you, that would be fabulous. But let's start with the Q&A where Mark has just finished, which is, we've had, and I'm going to group some of the questions. We've had a couple of questions clearly around, well, where can I go and get support? Where can I go and get help? We had a very specific question around, and it was from Steve Salter, around, well, is there any actual funding out there? So Steve and others, you've heard some of the answers to that. There is lots of help out there. Mark's actually absolutely bang on. It is very complex. There is a plethora of support. What I can promise you is that what I see across our region, our West Midlands region, and certainly across Cov Warwickshire and Greater Birmingham, is we are really good at brokering to each other, aren't we, Mark? We're really good at thinking, well, I've got a client here, I can't answer their question, but I absolutely know a man or a woman to go to. So I can promise our delegates we do that. But as you've heard, some great support out there from Aston University in terms of their low carbon support. As Mark mentioned, Coventry City actually run a green business support programme, which includes grants, lots of support that comes out through organisations such as Warwick Manufacturing Group, Chambers of Commerce and others. But question to the panel then, if the government, in terms of incentivisation, if the government could do anything that would really incentivise our small to medium-sized businesses to be more green, to go green, what do you think that incentivisation would be? So Miranda, am I okay to start with you first? Over to Miranda.
Thank you. I'm going to come back with that out of this sort of part carrot, part stick argument, in that, and this is, I know this is counter to my chamber sort of business support hat, but actually if we have all of those sorts of policy changes, it makes everybody start to look at this is where business is going. This isn't a one-off lure of a subsidy or a grant to move. This is actually business conditions changing. So we do need government to put those policy changes in place to drive forward. But then I think what would be really good would be a really clear government ratified system of green financing. So because we can't endlessly give grants, they become short term, and then you find that you've attracted the market and then you've disappeared again. Whereas if we actually have a sound system of green financing, and there are loads of schemes that people worry about what they can trust. So if we know which ones are kosher and which ones work, so that businesses can understand, okay, my payback period on putting this technology in is 5, 6, 7, 8 years. With the green financing, I can get that on very low interest or zero interest loan to fund me doing that now. And then the payback period comes from those savings. So it takes a sting out of it, but it isn't an ending bucket of money. I think that's a practical long-term solution.
Okay, thanks, Miranda. And I'll come to the other panel members to see if they've got any ideas. And just to put it into context, the reason Steve was asking this question was he was making the point that actually broadly, although we are seeing inflationary pressures, broadly the cost of energy is quite low at the moment, but businesses are incurring rising costs in all sorts of other ways, as we know, particularly if you are an importer and exporter. So that was why there was the call for, well, what is the government doing to help, or anybody doing to help, in terms of possibly funding or incentivisation? Mark, have you got any thoughts on this?
I mean, listen, obviously, to small businesses first. I think we're going to say that, aren't we? I think we need government to listen to small businesses. I think we do need a national programme which really demonstrates what best practice out there. There's some phenomenally good practice out there at the moment, which is often hidden away. And I think if we can show what is possible through technology or innovation or change, I think we can really make a difference. But I think a lot of it, as I say, is not accessible or available to small businesses. They just don't see it's there.
Laura, Leo, a question which might be a bit more difficult to you because it's not your world, it's more our world in terms of supporting businesses, grants, assist, funding, lobbying government. But working with the clients that you do work with, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all hanging off a bit of clarity, really. They come out with there's lots of papers coming out, industrialization papers, construction papers coming out, that we just don't get quite the detail that we're after. So we're really all hanging our hat on COP26 and the aftermath of that to hope that things come through a bit more clarity. But I think playing it down, and it's not just SMEs, it's, you know, some of the big PLCs are still waiting for the answers as well. So, you know, I think for them to be able to build on their strategy, they do need to have a really good set of toolkits or something that, you know, the same way we had during the pandemic, there was a really good, I think, communication system of that as to what was available, what wasn't, and I think that needs to be rolled out a bit more in the context of the path to net zero.
Okay, helpful. And the reason that's helpful, Laura, is it's a good segue to another question that we've had. And the question does relate to COP26. It was from Mark Freebies Apostle. And the question is, are we actually worried? Are we actually worried about the Green Deal? Are we worried about the deals that are being made at often that political level, and how they then impact on businesses? Miranda, are you worried about what might come out of COP26?
I'm worried about it the other way. I'm worried about that it won't be firm enough to actually make a difference, or that we'll get government agreement that then they back out of. And we've seen that with the virtual summit that was held by Joe Biden a few months ago, where President Erdogan of Turkey signed it immediately virtually within the room and then rescinded it within 24 hours. And that's why actually we do need them to be physically together and talking. But I think we have to do this, otherwise the impact of climate on our businesses and the fact that we aren't resilient to climate changes, looking at floods and temperature changes, etc. In the medium to long term, we have to do it. However, we have to make it work for the business community. Otherwise, the business community either won't do it, or will go bust, or will, you know, we have to make it positive. So it's about learning about all of those various different schemes and support, and really putting them into practical implementation, to encourage firms along that line, along that route, show them what, for instance, what Crystal Doors have done in terms of it really being a positive business move that's going to help you compete proactively with your competitors. And that's what we need to see come out of COP26 is not all carrots, definitely not all stick, definitely some carrots, but some action in both spheres, both the movement, but also the encouragement for businesses to really, really do this.
Thanks, Miranda. And again, I'm going to come to you in a sec, Mark, but I'm going to put a bit more context to that question. So I guess the context is, when we hear government announcements about how we should move to net zero, reduce our carbon footprint, be more sustainable, absolutely, I think everybody in this room today would support that. Of course, we've got to do it. But sometimes when the government announcements come out, and Mark, I'm thinking of the ones around electric vehicles, and the move away from diesel, and that we all had to go electric, and there was the timeline. And there was a genuine feeling, forgive me for saying, but of panic amongst suppliers, amongst consumers, amongst our big manufacturers, and I guess in context, that's where the worry comes from in terms of COP26. Any government setting out these targets, the targets clearly needing to be timely for us to be able to achieve them. But Mark, do you think generally we were and we have been able to respond around specifically the targets on electrification, autonomous vehicles, or has that created some challenges?
I mean, I think we're in a different place where we were last year, because finally we've got two gigafactories coming to the UK, obviously with British Volt in the Northeast and Nissan. We do need one now in the Midlands, obviously, for the UK and particularly for the Midlands automotive supply chain. So, I mean, the race is certainly on in the industry, and I was reading last night, sort of sad thing I do, but reading last night about the competition between Ford and GM now about who's going to open the biggest electric vehicle plant in the US. I mean, it would be the announcements that Ford have made. It would be the biggest car assembly plant in the US by some margin. Bigger than we had in the heyday of perhaps the 1970s, 1980s, perhaps. So we need that here. We do need the gigafactory in the Midlands to secure UK vehicle manufacture. And although it's 2030 for electric, for the end of passenger vehicles, internal combustion passenger vehicles, diesel and petrol, it's actually a little bit earlier than that because of the various trade tariffs which are in place. So it's more like 2027. Otherwise, we're going to be paying significant tariffs for producing vehicles in the UK and put them into Europe. So it's a race. We need action. We do need the gigafactory in the Midlands to really secure our very precious, innovative automotive industry.
Yeah, I wholly agree with that, Mark. Absolutely. Any thoughts from Laura and Leo?
I think, again, from our perspective, in terms of the original question about how it will affect UK business, I think a lot will depend on where the UK business market is themselves, I think, and the approach the government are going to take. If they're going to go down a non-alignment route or a dynamic alignment route, or actually go for higher ambition, I'm hopeful they will go for higher ambition rather than just either backtrack from the EU position or just toe the line. I think if Britain can be kind of a forerunner, then that's great. I think the problem we will have is the extent to which you're supplying into the US. They'll prefer that lower level. But the extent you're going to the EU, they're going to want to make sure that you've got all those carbon border, adjustment taxes in place, that they can't be seen to be, favouring nations that aren't committing to these changes. I think it's going to be a real juggling act, I think, of trying to get that balance just right. Again, sort of echoing really what Miranda said about it's got to work, it's got to be a bit of stick and carrot.
Cheers, Laura. And one of the helpful things about sustainable events such as the one today is that sometimes it takes experts like you to be able to break down the sort of the national target or what's being said by our politicians, break that down into the detail of either what it could mean for industries within sectors. So again, I picked up on one of the question around, well, the challenge is that we may have a sector, but within that sector, say manufacturing, will have food and drink versus, you know, manufacturing equipment. There's so many different industries and so many different ways of being able to or having to respond to our net zero targets. I just wanted to say that this kind of event, this kind of educational process is really, really helpful. And I would urge all of our delegates, again, to think about some of those pathways that our speakers today, our speakers have spoken about pathways. Leo and Laura, I love the scope 1, 2, 3, almost like a toolkit, you know, that you could follow that through as a toolkit to fundamentally just help you within business do the simplest of things, as we all try and move along this path of committing and working towards net zero. But therein lies my question to the panel before I come on to my final question around that good practice. The final questions of the panel, which again came from some of our delegates, thank you so much to the delegates, is, and Mark, you did touch on this in your presentation a little bit, is, you know, where do we think businesses are, small to medium-sized enterprises, in terms of that scope 1, 2 and 3, Laura and Leo, going from thinking about your company vehicles all the way through to procurement, supply chains, all the way through to the end of life treatment for your products. Where do we really think our small to medium-sized businesses are on that pathway? Mark, you touched on that only one in 10 probably measure their carbon footprint. Is that the place to start? Where do you think we are? Mark, did you want to go first?
Yeah, and just to add a bit to that, what I said about 1 in 10, you'd find that startups and early stage companies are more likely to have more sustainable practice. That's what the research says. If you're you know, more established firms, it's less so. Yeah, where are we? I mean, we're sort of, the race is on, I think. You know, we're probably lap 1 of you know, of a 10, maybe less than that, a 10 lap race. But the race is on really, and we need to do more. Really, we need to do more. I'll put it as that.
Leo, you see more business? Do you see more clients coming to the table because they are looking to work and to do things to commit to net zero through, for example, their procurement? Are you seeing more interest, more commitment, more enthusiasm?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of businesses that are ready but haven't yet taken those steps. So, you know, Mark speaks about the 1 in 10 that recorded. The other, you know, 8 of the other 9 are probably looking to, you know, start making positive steps towards it. I think what Mark touched upon his earlier presentation was looking for those easy wins as a good way to get started. I think that JMC example was a really excellent example of, I mean, a lot of businesses work off an 80-20 rule, that 20% of operations cause 80% of emissions. And I think that's a really good example of how that rule is in practice.
Okay, thanks, Leo. Right, I'm conscious of time, so I'm now going to come to my panel because it was one of our questions. I'm going to ask you each to give me a case study or some best practice that you've seen, because that's a lovely way to finish positively. My example comes from the room today because I've just spotted that within our delegates we have a gentleman, Ian Jamie, Stager Clear Packaging, and I know Mark will know him as well, and I know that Stager Packaging, Stager Clear have gone humongous steps to absolutely work towards environmentally friendly packaging for their customers, made huge strides within their business in terms of that commitment to net zero. So Miranda, do you want to go first? Have you got some good practice?
Yes, I'm going to cheat and give you 2 briefly. The first is Heinz in Wigan. They actually literally do make the beans and the ketchup there. And this is an example with the sting in the tail, in that they have done a massive amount to reduce their impact. They have a system where the warm water that comes out of their processes actually runs around the outside of their building and heats it, so that the water gets cool so they can discharge it, but it saves them having to heat the building. It's cut the heating bill massively. They have a system where all of their waste is processed on site, and loads of it is recycled, like all of the tin is recycled on site, so they're not putting waste down. They have an awful lot of internal recycling, so that they're avoiding, they really have reduced their environmental impact, and they're saving £2 million a year every year because of that. However, they made all those changes for financial reasons in 1999. Where has the rest of the world been? You know, we're missing huge amounts of business gain that we should be doing, and we would be so much further on if we did all those things now. But I just want to remind you again, for instance, crystal doors, loads and loads of environmental benefit, but also loads of financial benefit, and they've been given the Queen's Award for Enterprise for Sustainable Development for 2021.
Okay, thanks, Miranda. Leo and Laura, who's going to give us an example from your perspective, a good practice example?
Shall I go? I'll go basic. I'm not going to go as grand as Heinz. I'm going to go for actually one of our smaller clients, actually, that just set up an employee network. They've got everybody to take accountability within their business, everyone to contribute, because everybody's got a role to play, whether that is from a financial perspective, whether it's you're procuring your business's electricity, whoever it is that's controlling these different things. There will be, I guarantee, a scope 3 emission reduction you can make within one of those businesses. They came together and they tested it out, and they came up with a plan. They came up with a really basic but plan that's effective and putting into place.
Yeah, love it. Okay, Mark.
So your example reminded me, Louise, of another packaging company. So, I think arguably this is all subjective, but Hotel Chocolate makes some of the best chocolate, I think. Yeah, really lovely product. What's really interesting, though, from a manufacturing point of view, that their packaging comes from the waste plastic bottle industry. In fact, the company, the small business that supplies into them, we've done a lot of work with. They take 1 million plastic bottles a year, and they turn it into food grade plastic, which is very difficult, which goes into plastic packaging for Hotel Chocolate and a number of other different sectors. In fact, the challenge they have is getting more plastic, and in fact, we feel like they're going to have to open a number of manufacturing hubs close to the supply of industrial plastic waste or post-consumer plastic waste around the UK. But yeah, amazing what you can do with something which is a waste and put it onto a packaging which is something as good as Hotel Chocolate. But I'm biased because I like it.
So do I. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Okay, guys, I'm absolutely conscious of time. We need to wrap it up. Thank you so much for all of the Q&As in the chat that's still coming through, including, I saw that, I can see that, Ian, that Hotel Chocolate are one of your biggest customers in terms of packaging. Good to hear. So thank you for all the chat, including I can see some of the chat that's coming through in terms of offers of support and help that is out there. I want to say a huge thank you once again to our sponsors, Aston University, Arup, Morgan Sindel, and the University of Birmingham. A huge thank you to our experts, our speakers today, Miranda, Leo, Laura, and Mark. Thank you so much for your valuable time. I do appreciate how busy you are. Big thank you to our audience. Thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate your time. Do get involved in this series of events. I know the next event coming up will be about the kinds of support and potentially funding, grants, loans that you could get to help your business move along in terms of your commitment to net zero. So thank you all so much for attending today. Well done to William. So William Hargreaves is the role that is fully funded by Coventry and Warwickshire Chamber of Commerce, employed by Greater Birmingham Chamber of Commerce to absolutely focus on how we work with and how we support businesses along their journey towards net zero. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today. It's been a really good session. I've learnt loads. Thank you and goodbye.